after infidelity, one of the most important questions that you have to ask yourself is whether or not you're staying or leaving. And sometimes that pressure to make that decision can be coming from other people, what friends think, what your partner wants to hear, what your family thinks, religious communities. But a lot of the pressure also comes internally because the uncertainty around infidelity is really uncomfortable. So your reality is chaotic and your mind is just looking for something solid that it can orient itself around. And so it starts saying to itself, if I could just decide whether I'm staying or leaving, maybe I could finally feel settled again. One problem, though, is that, especially if you're early on and you're listening to this, is that the greatest urgency you'll probably feel right away, but that might not be the best time to make it. You might want to have a little bit of space and clarity in your own thinking to be able to evaluate things. And I think that we make this whole decision making process so much harder by really overcomplicating what decision making actually requires. And so, one thing to be clear on is that your own mind craves certainty more than it actually wants a good decision. Because there's a huge amount of uncertainty after infidelity. What you don't know, whether or not people can change, whether or not they'll cheat again, whether or not you'll have regret staying, whether you'll have regret leaving, whether you can trust them, whether you can trust anyone, what would happen if you did leave the relationship in terms of a romantic new partnership, what would happen financially. And your mind does not like having a million different questions floating around all at once. So it starts trying to force closure. And it's like having a bunch of different tabs open that you need them all open for work. It's part of your job. But part of you just wants to close all of them out just so that your computer, so your mind can kind of breathe for a bit. And so this can be the point where your brain is screaming at you saying, I just need to know what I'm going to do with this relationship. But one of the decisions that you have available, as silly and obvious as it sounds, one decision you can make is to say, I'm not making a decision right now. That is my decision. This creates some distance and it creates some room for you to gather some information and gather your thoughts. You can see whether their behavior actually changes. You can sort through some of the initial emotional overwhelm. It helps you calculate how much you can handle it financially. And the best thing to do is to give yourself some type of rough time frame. To say, I'm not deciding for the next 2 weeks. Just that, you can decide that again in 2 weeks. But you can do that to give yourself the permission to not freak out about not having made a decision yet. It's like, no, I'm intentionally choosing to not make a decision yet. And then when it comes to deciding, like I said, we often overcomplicate things. We start researching things like, are anxious and avoidant attachment styles compatible? Can cheaters really change? Does my partner deserve forgiveness? Is what they did bad enough that I should leave? Would a healthy person stay after this? And there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be said about all of those. But none of them actually can tell you what you want. You could discover that your attachment styles are theoretically compatible and still not want the relationship. You could decide that you could realize that your attachment styles, astrological signs, MBTI, like they could all say on paper that you're incompatible and still decide that you want to be with them. There are no rules about what has to or can't align. Moral judgment and personal decision making are not the same exact process. At some point, you need to just figure out what you want. And then, once you figure out what you want, you also need to consider what is the price tag that comes with that choice. Because every choice has its own consequences, both good and bad. There is no decision that you select that has no benefits, and there's no decision that you could select that has no downsides. Everything has a pros and cons list attached to it. And this isn't just about choosing a partner or deciding what to do after infidelity. There are pros and cons to whether you wake up at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. There are pros and cons to whether you get coffee or tea. There are pros and cons to whether I wear this shirt or a different shirt. There are pros and cons to choosing a career field that you go into versus a different one. There are pros and cons of choosing whether or not to have kids with someone. If you leave someone that you still love, the cost may be grief, loneliness, financial disruption, changes with your children, losing a shared future, or wondering whether the relationship could be repaired. If you stay, the cost may be going through a difficult rebuilding process, tolerating uncertainty, dealing with triggers, accepting that you're choosing to trust someone who's already demonstrated they're capable of betraying you, and risking the possibility that that happens again. Neither choice is without pain. So instead of asking which option has no downside, Ask, which downside am I willing to accept for what I want? And that's where being clear on the previous step of actually knowing what do you want is so important. So what do I want? And am I willing to accept the full price tag, both pros and cons that come with that? And so let's consider an example. Like imagine you are desperately wanting to be with this person, but you also have strong evidence that they are very likely to cheat again. Maybe they've already done it repeatedly and they're still lying and they're not changing anything. Now you have two competing values. One is, I do want to preserve this relationship. The other is, I want to minimize my chances of experiencing another betrayal. And you're not able to maximize for both of those. So then you have two possible answers. One would be, I love this person enough that I'm willing to take a very significant risk that I'll be cheated on because I consider this person worth risking it for. That is a decision you can make. Is it the smart decision? No. Everything on paper says that's wrong. You're still able to choose it if you want to. Or maybe your answer is, as much as I love them, protecting myself from another round of this matters more to me than preserving this relationship. And that's not selfish of you. That's not unromantic of you. You just want to protect your own mental sanity. That is also a good decision. And that is the one that probably most people would say on paper makes more sense. What I'm really getting at is you need to learn to think in terms of trade-offs, not right and wrong. People get stuck in indecision because they're looking for some objectively correct answer. But when in the world does life give you easy choices where it's always yes or no, it's always black and white? Like you're dealing with probabilities, you're dealing with uncertainties, especially in the context of relationships. People aren't these puzzle pieces where if you just get them situated just so everything clicks together. It's messy, it's unclear, they act inconsistent within their own character. And so you have to stop asking yourself, how do I guarantee that I'll never be hurt? And start considering, given what I know, what risks am I willing to take on for the life that I actually want? And if this is all extremely overwhelming, especially if you are in the earlier stages, definitely separate decisions out. You can tackle decisions in smaller pieces. You don't have to settle on the question right now of, what am I going to do with this relationship forever? A smaller question could be, what do I want to do next? Which path do I want to start taking the first step down, even if I choose to change my mind later? Maybe you want to spend a month seeing whether your partner follows through and then making a decision based off that. Or maybe you know that right now you need physical separation and you're not sure whether that will lead to reconciliation or permanent separation. Maybe you want to attempt reconciliation and see what happens, and you're willing to kind of throw it all in, knowing that it might be a major mistake. Maybe you already know that you want out. Maybe you're genuinely undecided. All of those are legitimate places to be, and all of them have very small actions that can create some momentum, create some movement, instead of just being stuck in this space of inertia, where the longer that you just stay in one spot, the harder it is to keep getting things moving again. So what is the smallest decision you can make right now that is aligned to what you want? And so I want to hammer this home again. If you're trying to decide what to do, you need to ask yourself, what do I actually want? Not what should I want, not what does my partner want, not what does my partner deserve, not what do my friends expect, what do I want? And then get really clear on the second piece. What would pursuing that require me to accept or sacrifice? And then finally, is what I want worth that cost to me? Not to other people, to me. And as you ask yourself this question, you should expect, because it is a hard decision, that you'll have at least two different things that are going to be in conflict with each other. And that's where the real decision needs to be made. It's not about good and bad or right and wrong, am I smart or stupid? It's about two things that you value that are contradictory. They're in conflict with one another in this context. And if that's the case, be kind to yourself. Maybe the decision is that you need a little bit more time to think about it. Allow yourself to make that decision if you need to.